To Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature. I'm your host, Brooke Mitchell, and today's topic is World Animal Day Special Asian Wildlife Back from the Brink with Nat Hab Expedition Leader Conan Dumenil. Thank you so much for being here today, Conan. Over to you.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you for that introduction. Hello to all our folks, and thank you for joining me on this lovely Friday afternoon. It's Friday night for me here, and I'm sitting on a nice rainy night in the southern part of India, in the city of Bangalore. And before you folks joined us, I was having a little chat with our co-host Brooke here, and was talking about how India this week is celebrating Wildlife Week. So the first week of October is a time where especially educational institutions, well, the government as well, and a lot of local authorities promote, the investment into uh, the natural heritage of this country by having a lot of events around places, celebrating the national heritage of this country and our animals in particular. And I'm sitting here with my lovely animal cup with the nice cup of coffee, which actually comes from a tiger reserve not very far from where I live. And the reason I'm starting with this is we've seen over the past few decades or so, a lot of initiatives across the country, or a national wide sort of movement towards understanding our heritage and valuing our heritage, which speaks volumes of, or rather will hold conservation in good stead if you were to do this. And I think the primary part about um the conservation of animals, if we were to speak, or the conservation of wild spaces, comes with our begins with our relationship with it. And so we've seen a flurry of initiatives growing, and it only augurs well for the wildlife in this country. And having said that, today is actually World Animal Day, and it's celebrated on the 4th of October because of the birthday of the patron saint of animals, Saint Francis of Assisi. Now, while I was looking into this presentation and doing my bit of research for this, I found that there's a lot of traction in Europe and Asia during this time, because Saint Francis Assisi, who of course belonged to the order of the Franciscan monks, and many of them traveled across Asia as well, setting up educational institutions and so on, and is a very, very revered personality. I'm not sure whether it's a big thing in Northern America, but using that opportunity to talk about animals today, and more importantly about their conservation. Now, the World Animal Day actually um, started in 1925 in Germany by a writer and publisher by the name of Heinrich Zimmermann. And he used to be a writer in the magazine called The Hound, The Man and Hound. And the whole idea behind this was to get a day where you get all animal lovers worldwide, people like you and me, in celebration of the animals, wonderful animals that we have around us. Now, we've come a long way. It's exactly, well, almost 100 years ago, 99 years ago. And the first event had 5,000 people attending this. And then since then, the movement has grown. And like I said, today, where I am at, it is almost a national movement where we see, and it's wonderful to see, students, college students participate in various competitions and quizzes, in sort of where they can showcase the wonderful nature that we have around us. And truly, it has taken a global image now. I was looking at my Facebook this morning, and you could see posts from all around the world celebrating animals. Now, I wanted to use this day sort of as context, or as a staging point, to talk about Asian wildlife in general. Now, many of you who have traveled, or are aware with Asian wildlife, often you'll have a few flagship species come to your mind. And right at the forefront, the center of it all is probably the tiger, which is the tiger, which is probably the quintessential Asian animal that everyone wants to see or is in awe of. But there are fantastic species around us. The panda, which has been the symbol of conservation as association with WWF for decades now, and also things like the Asian elephant, king cobras, rhinos. So all of these are flagship species that you would associate with the Asian subcontinent. And I want to highlight a little bit of their stories over the past century or so, and where they were a few decades ago to where we are now. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, because of course there are a lot of animals to talk about, and I personally love talking about all sorts of animals under the sun. But for the purpose of this presentation, I like to restrict it to animals that a NatHab traveler would generally see when they travel in these parts. So an animal which you would normally encounter, because all of them have interesting stories. And I think part of the reason why we travel is because we know the stories behind them as well, and we also want to do something to ensure their survival. Now, having said that, the reason why we celebrate the success of this, I would like to take you back a century or a little more than that uh, in the past, to give you some context as to why it is important today and why we're talking about it today. Now, it's important to understand the background, and like we all know, views, perspectives, needs of the 18th and 19th century is very different from the 20th, and so just to set the stage for that. Now, travel back with me 100 years ago. Asia was the most sought after, even right from the 16th, 17th century. Asia was a much sought after destination. A lot of it started with the spice trade, and many of it continued to other natural products as well. Things like ivory, peacocks, elephants, captive animals such as cheetahs, tigers, all of these were, to put it in today's context, important trade commodities, and much of Western trade relied on finding these routes to Asia. So when I say Asia, we're talking in particularly Southeast Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Nepal, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Indochina as well, the regions, and of course China too. So these were important points. Tea drove most of the trade, pepper, cardamom, clove, and like I said, some of the important commodities that these countries were rich in also included animal and animal products. So here you have pictures of a market where they're trading everything from what appears to be wine in amphora to elephant tusks. There is a picture of a traditional ivory turning or an ivory carving artisan based in Sri Lanka. And of course, the very, very large uh, buzzing ports that were all across the subcontinent at that point of time. And for to give you some more information, the subcontinent, when we talk about, refers to India, Sri Lanka, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Burma, and that whole chunk. Now, this trade flourished right from Arab times to Romans, to the Phoenicians, and then later on to imperial colonies, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the French, the British, and the Danish. Now, all of these European powers, and you have to think about at that point of time where the powerhouses in the civilized world, in the Western world, and they were constantly looking at procuring items from Asia, and were also looking for markets where they could exchange some of their produce. Now, because of all of this trade, they had treaties, sometimes very, very lucrative treaties, sometimes more hostile relationships with the local countries or kingdoms that were in there. And one would think that the trade was a bit one-sided at times if you look at all the data. But what also happened in a few hundred years, especially in the latter part of the 18th century and the early 19th century, that you had many Europeans coming into the subcontinent to because of the trade, but also stayed here to administer and manage their colonies in the Far East or Southeast Asia, and that resulted in a huge decimation of our wildlife at that point. Um, Now, I would not say that it was just because of the European colonization that we lost our wildlife. There was always hunting traditions that pre-existed in these places, but there was definitely a large support, and very often local kings would invite visiting European dignitaries to kind of show off their natural heritage. And in those days, it was expressed by going out and shooting a dozen tigers or a couple of rhinos on elephant back, and these were um, in today's day and ages, think of it as a as an official lunch or an official dinner where state dignitaries are called in. This was sort of part of that whole culture at that point of time. Now, reading the accounts of this is actually, heartbreaking, because you would see, they talk about these massive hunts where they would go out on a couple of dozen elephants, corral a few animals in a particular area, have massive hunting parties of a few hundred people go out, and then the sportsmen or the shooters would be on elephant back and actually take easy pickings at some of the animals that were there. Now, a lot of this was done indiscriminately, and because the subcontinent was a collection of a close to 1,000 kingdoms across these 4 or 5 countries that I mentioned, uh, many of these kingdoms would have, as part of their foreign relations or foreign policy, have a lot of these hunts, or the shikar, as they used to call it back in the day, which resulted in a drastic drop of our, some of our flagship species. Now, compounding that, as we grew into the 19th and 20th century, industrialization hit Europe earlier, and with the two wars from the early 1900s all the way up to the 1950s, we saw a mass expansion in industrialization, where as a result of it, we lost a large tracts of forests across India and Nepal, and Sri Lanka as well. I talk about these three countries in particular because this is where the colonies had, imperial powers had the biggest colonies. And so much of the land came under either agriculture, a lot of the timber, hardwood trees were all taken out for shipbuilding to feed the war machine across Europe. And today, when we looked at, I think some reports say there were close to about 10,000 tigers at the end of the 19th century, and all of this dropped to under a couple of thousand uh, in mid-century, mid of this century, as we're talking about. So there were many factors that came into play here. The expansion of railways was one, where it did wonders to connect uh, big land masses with each other, connect the hinterlands to the ports. It also resulted in a lot of disappearance of forests. As a result, many animals were displaced. Many communities were displaced, and it wasn't a great time. I would say, if you were someone who was interested in the welfare of animals, and many writings people wrote about it. In fact, some of our earliest wildlife laws date back to the early 1850s or the 1880s, where people realized that we're not seeing as many tigers as there were 20 years ago. We're not seeing as many rhinos as there were, and in fact, one such story is a story for a park that we go in Kaziranga, where Lady Curzon, who was the wife of the viceroy to India at that point of time, remarked at how they went into this national park to see rhinos and they didn't find any. And that was the start of the wildlife protection movement that happened across the country. So there were acts of parliament that were made, there were laws passed to preserve wildlife, and it's taken its course through the journey, in which I will talk about in subsequent slides, um, and has now in the case of a few species has been a very, very resounding success. Now, at the center of this all, like the center of my picture in the previous slide, stands the Bengal tiger. Now, I think, sorry, in the Indian context, I think the tiger uh, not only holds a very, very special place, but also one of our biggest success stories in terms of protection. The Bengal tiger, like I said, earlier numbers in the late 1800s put it at about 10,000 tigers across India, and this is unpartitioned India. Today, we have close to about 3,200 tigers that exist. But in the middle of this all was a huge drop where tigers came down to probably under 1,000 tigers at the beginning of the 20th century. And it was due to uh, a story I mean, due to a conservation initiative called the Project Tiger, which was started in 1973. Our then Prime Minister at the time, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, was one of the first to take note of this and start India's very first comprehensive wildlife protection act, aptly called the Wildlife Protection Act of India in 1973. And over then, the numbers have grown. In 2006, we witnessed a drop in tiger population due to poaching in areas. And then since 2006, we've had several laws and several bodies um, involved in this process, mostly through actions of governments, large scale organizations, and works on the ground, which has now brought the number up. So today, India accounts for about 70% of the wildlife, of tigers out in the wild. And very often, when you're on a trip now to some of our best parks, you will see scenes like this, where it's so heartening to see cubs reach adulthood, reach full size, and then see them have subsequent litters and so on. So it is a growing population and has been one of our resounding successes. But like I said, it involved concerted efforts across the board, not just national policy, but also small scale initiatives, which I will talk about as we go along in this. Another species that was on the brink that has now come back is the one-horned rhino. We have rhinos. The Indian one-horned rhino is across India and Nepal at the moment, and between both these countries there are about 2,000 rhinos. There's about 700 plus rhinos in Nepal and about 1,300 rhinos in India, and they're all spread across a very small area on the northern part of India and southern reaches of Nepal, in an area which we call the Terai, which is basically a floodplain between the Ganges and the Brahmaputra River. Now, like I mentioned earlier, a few minutes earlier, the rhino almost reached a few hundred individuals. In fact, I think the numbers in India were down to about 66 rhinos in the 1950s. So they had really been shot out, hunted out. Loss of habitat contributed to their downfall. And today we are looking at numbers surging to about, I beg your pardon, not 1,500 rhinos, but 2,500 rhinos across both these countries. Um, and again, largely it has been the effort of the governments and organizations on the field as well, which included working with communities, restoring habitat, and of course, very, very direct action in terms of hunting and bans of hunting and so on. Nepal has a very, very interesting management strategy. In fact, the country right now has 0% poaching for rhinos, and one of the best places to see them is in the Chitwan National Park, and you'll often see scenes like this. Uh, the combination of the conservation efforts in Nepal include the government, the National Conservation Authority, and the army, who actually patrol. Most of the conservation acts were done by the royal family because Nepal was a monarchy, and so they came under direct protection of the royal family. And these acts were passed, and wherein the previous king had actually empowered a whole battalion of the army to actually take care of the protection network, and they came down really, really hard with sort of zero tolerance to poaching in the area, which has now resounded in the growth of these rhinos. So I think the current rhino count in Nepal is about 768 adult rhinos, which are there at the moment. Now, moving further down in the Tarai, is something that is another species that probably does not have the charisma as the tiger or the rhino, but a well-loved one. Well, at least I personally still do love it nonetheless. And this is the hard ground Barasinga. Now, the Barasinga, the name literally translates 12 horns, and it's a medium-sized deer, slightly larger than your mule deer that you have in North America. But it has the males have this lovely rack of horns, which have about 12 to 14 tines on them, and the males have this wonderful behavior where they like swampy areas. Close to lakes and ponds or water bodies, and the males have this wonderful thing where they'll sort of dig the ground and get a bunch of reeds on top of their antlers to sort of show off to the females, makes them at least in the Barasinga world they find that a very, very attractive quality. They have a wonderful bugling call, and which you must, when you travel to India, you will have the chance of hearing them when you're on safari in central India. Usually early in the morning, you have these lovely swamp lands. It's misty, and it's just a wonderful call. And you see at the center of the picture there is this male with his head uh, up, tilted up, just about to bugle here. Now the Barasinga again. Numbers dropped. A lot of it was because of habitat loss, and of course poaching as well was a contributor. But also imagine in a country where the population is growing, you're looking constantly for land to farm, and so a lot of these swamp lands which were considered inhabitable or useless lands in terms of the value they bring ecologically were put under cultivation. As that a result of that, there were you lose out a lot of habitat, and species that are dependent on these swampy grasslands like the Barasinga, the hog deer, the pygmy hog in eastern part of India, all of them suffered. And well, thankfully now that the approach is more ecological, it is more wholesome in the sense that we're trying to understand ecosystems uh, in its plurality, and not just looking at a patch of trees and saying, okay, this is a forest, we must protect it. But what about our grasslands? What about the rocky hill crops that we hilly outcrops that we see? These are all important ecological niches that support a vast variety of wildlife. Now, the population of the Barasinga has increased to over 1,000 adult individuals now. Thanks again to a lot of captive breeding of these animals and soft releases and hard releases eventually into areas that they once populated. The state of Madhya Pradesh, which is in the center of India, where we do uh, the Grand India wildlife trip, which is one of our probably most all encompassing wildlife trips you could do in Asia, where you see a variety of wildlife across three different habitats. Madhya Pradesh has been one of the success stories for the Barasinga. We have two different populations, three now, in fact, at different parts of India and in Nepal. And the Central India Barasinga is unique is in that it is a subspecies, and they call it the hard-ground Barasinga. And now the Barasinga has been, thanks to the captive breeding processes, has been released to much of their former habitat. However, the numbers are still growing. There is still an active program happening, and many of the times we get these questions when you're driving around in the national park. You might see a fenced area, and it's an interesting story to tell guests when you're traveling there. And if you've traveled with us before, I'm sure your expedition leader or your guide has told you the significance behind having a small little boma or a fence in the middle of the national park, because these were protected areas and breeding grounds for the Barasinga. Now, moving on further eastward from the Barasinga, is an animal that is not considered pretty in many books. In fact, it's quite oddly shaped and oddly odd looking, and I think to its detriment hasn't received as much as love as some of these cute and cuddly furry things that we've seen earlier, and that is the gharial. Now, the gharial is one of the largest species of crocodile in the world, and the subcontinent of India, Nepal, and Bhutan have three species of crocodile, and the gharial is one of them. So you have the freshwater crocodile, the mugger, you have the gharial, and you have the saltwater crocodile. Now, the gharial is unique in the sense that it eats only fish, and it is a large crocodile, and it prefers slow to medium flowing rivers. But what they actually need are these large sandbanks in which to breed. Now, this is a picture of a male. You see, it's got a very, very slender snout and a row full of very evenly spaced out teeth, I must say. But that slender snout is an adaptation that helps them catch fish underwater. It reduces the drag, and they actually swish their head around to literally impale a fish within their jaws. And the most notable thing is this sort of bulbous growth at the edge of its snout, which in Hindi is called the gada, hence which means pot, hence the name Gharial. Now, the gharial are fantastic in another sense that it's probably the only species, if not the only species of crocodile that exhibits parental behavior, and all the parental work is done by the males. The females come, they lay their eggs in the nest on these sandbanks, and after their hatchlings emerge, it's the male who actually has several females who he's mated with and sired these hatchlings from, takes care of this little nursery of these little gharial babies, which and he patrols that area of his turf to ensure their protection. Now, the pot is believed, and there are acoustic studies done, that the male is able to emit certain sounds from his pot, that gharial, the gada at the end of his snout, and and he calls out to the hatchlings, and when they all gather close to the male, get on his back if he needs to evacuate them out of water. And that's such a it's such a fantastic phenomenon, and very, very rarely seen, well, in the natural world, but definitely not seen in the reptile world, where you see a parent taking care of hundreds of hatchlings. Now, the gharial is still a critically endangered animal, and there was an initiative in the 70s that started not very far from where I live, in fact, in the city of Chennai, where a naturalist and conservationist by the name of Romulus Whitaker, who I'll talk to you about, started this breeding program for the three species of wild crocodile that we have in the subcontinent. And that, again, has been a resounding success. In fact, they have more crocodiles now than they can hold. And thanks to the breeding programs that set off, a lot of the initial science and data that they learned there has now been replicated in countries across, such as Nepal and Bhutan, where the numbers have been returning back to their old haunts. Now, there is still probably under 600 individuals, adult individuals of gharials in the wild still. There is still a lot of work to go. And the reason why they are struggling right now, in spite of very successive breeding programs, is the loss of habitat. Now, if you recall, I mentioned earlier the gharials need these large sand banks, and with human interference or human influence on a river, we end up losing these sandbanks. So it could be something from quarrying, it could be the construction of dams, it could be the deepening of waterways of some important river channels for trade and transport. A lot of this has resulted in a direct habitat loss. Therefore, the gharials don't breed. In fact, there is one group of gharial that I've been seeing over 20 years now in a park that I regularly visit, and I haven't seen them breed at all. And there's this one lone male there, and he's one of the biggest crocodiles I've ever seen, and he has a harem of probably six to eight females, and even though it's within a protected area, and they've done all that they could. They have not really bred we haven't seen them breed in the past 2 decades there. But outside of that, there have been areas which have successfully released gharials back in the wild. In fact, on our Nepal tour that we visit a gharial breeding center to look at the work that they've been doing there. Um, there is the number of gharials across countries vary. There's probably about 200 odd gharials in Nepal, less than that in Bhutan, and about 600 odd gharials that we see in India. And again, these are restricted to very, very few river systems. But there is an ongoing program. It is still there. And of course, releasing a large reptile in the wild comes with that bit of work that you need to do with the community as well, and convince them that it is good for the system too. Now, moving on to an animal that we also associate with the Asian context is the Asian elephant. Now, they're smaller in size to the African elephant and few other morphological differences. And Asian elephants were probably quintessential to Asia as they were to Africa. In fact, a lot of domestication, the earliest domestication of elephants happened in Asia, and they were used throughout the world. If think about Hannibal's of Carthage's conquest of Rome, where he took elephants across the Alps, and those were Asian elephants. So they have had a place in history. They have been used in warfare. They have been used in trade. They have been used in lumbering and for work. Um, and today we are looking at where, at least in the Indian context, and across in Nepal as well, a reduction in the domestication of elephants. Now, like I said, a lot of our wildlife laws uh, prohibit capturing animals from the wild. So unless it's an occasion where an elephant has gone rogue or causing destruction, most of the elephants across this landscape are left in the wild. But unfortunately, for a large animal, you do need a large landscape. And again, in a country or in countries with growing populations, we are developing countries where the populations are growing. The needs are very different from, say, the Western world. We are still finding our feet in terms of technology and progress and development. Uh, there is always a constant conflict for land space, and sharing land with some of these animals often does not end up well for the animals themselves. So right now there's probably about 10,000 odd elephants left in the wild, and again these are isolated to a few parts in southern Nepal, northern India, central India, and southern India. So earlier they would be across the landscape, but now they've shrunk to certain parts. And a large conservation initiative, which I'll talk about right now in a few slides from now, is linking up of all of these corridors to ensure that they have free space to roam. Now, as some of you would know, elephants are migratory. They follow these age-old patterns between feeding grounds, between the seasons, and this is almost genetically imprinted into them. So you'd see families follow it generation after generation between these areas, and that's often where the biggest conflict comes in, because they're passing through human habitation, which has suddenly sprung up over the years. So since the 60s, and then most certainly in the 90s, there has been concerted efforts to increase these corridors between the habitats which these elephants live in. And India had this thing called the Project Elephant, thanks to the success of Project Tiger, and then subsequently Project Rhino and Project Elephant. Um, it has been successful in increasing the numbers. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, which has the largest of the Asian elephants. In fact, the subspecies of animals you see, there's much darker and larger than the ones you see in the Indian in the Indian landscape, on the Nepal landscape. But they had a drastic fall by about 65% thanks to historical ivory trade, and then which continued on up to the 20th century, um, 19th and 20th century. Uh, but Sri Lanka now has some of the strictest protection laws against elephant. It's probably, as far as I know, I think it is the only country on the planet that has a death penalty if you were convicted of killing an elephant. Um, Again, without getting into a discussion of penalties, uh, I think in terms of a national level movement, it shows how important a particular species is to a nation. The conservation efforts across Sri Lanka have resounded. In fact, one of the best places to see them, and you see them quite easily across many parts of Sri Lanka. Large migration herds like this one here, a few hundreds, gathered around the dry season around water bodies. And some of my best moments with elephants have been from a park when I visited Sri Lanka a few years ago. So from elephants, again, I would move. A lot of my presentation, I'm realizing now at this point, talks about mammals, uh, because they are something I think a lot of us easily associate with. But I like to bring in, a few of the odd ones out, like the gharial and so on, just to say that yes, all animals are important, but focusing on the flagship ones, the ones that kind of everyone relates to, or more familiar with. We now move to another animal that one would normally not associate with India. And for many of you, it might be news that we actually have lions in India. So, the Indian subcontinent in general, across the countries of India, Nepal, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, and Bangladesh, has the highest density of wildcats anywhere in the world. We have about 15 wildcats across here, and in a couple of months ago in another webinar, I spoke about wildcats, especially the spotted ones, uh, and the density of animals, the cats that we have here, and lions are one of them. So these are the Asiatic lions. They differ slightly morphologically or physically from African lions. And one of the first things that you'll notice, it does not have a very large mane. It has a lot of black on the mane, which comes lower down, and in fact, in many local languages across the western part of India, they actually call it the bearded tiger or a bearded sher, which basically means large cat. Um, and Scientists have postulated that this could be the fact because of the habitat they live in. Now, these lions do not live in open savanna type grasslands, but they live in scrub forests, scrub and thorny, sort of semi arid forests. And having a lack of mane on the top of the head, much like myself, is an adaptation for where they're able to crawl between the scrubland and not get the wonderful, locks caught up amongst the thorny trees. So as a result, they compensate in terms of a beard, and they have quite luscious beard, I must say. Now, Asiatic lions um, were literally uh, they were on the brink of extinction. I know we're talking about animals that have been on the brink, but these guys were literally holding on by a hair's breadth before they were completely wiped out from this planet. There was close. I think they'd come down to about 20 individuals in the world from just this one small pocket in western part of India, and a lot of this was due to again habitat loss and hunting, especially. Much of the medieval age hunts seeked out lions and cheetahs, and in fact, the cheetah is an animal that had gone extinct out of India in the 70s. These two animals, out of all the large cats, these two cats faced the most destruction and had come down to 20 odd individuals that were there, in the early part of the 20th century. But again, due to very concerted conservation efforts, we've seen the population now grow to about 600, close to 700 odd individuals by the year 2020. So, and their numbers are increasing. In fact, now because we're looking at the flip side of this conservation effort. Because they were restricted to one national park area in one particular region, they're now beginning to spill over. So they are looking at other areas where they can protect and move some of these species out. Because also from an ecological perspective, we're looking at issues such as inbreeding, infighting, and just a lack of genetic diversity amongst these species. So, and in case there's an epidemic or so, it could wipe out the entire population. In fact, some of our first COVID cases came from four lions in Gujarat, the state that has them. So there has been um, an active involvement in this. And an interesting thing here is that the community, local communities, were involved in the process as well. Many of them were trained as lion trackers or lion followers, where they follow these pride of lions, report back to the Department of Forests, checking in on the well-being. Communities that lived in the forests were given alternatives to move out, given alternative livelihoods, so they don't have to rely and keep an inviolate space in the forest for these animals. And a lot of effective management practices have gone into this process. But still, I don't think they're out of danger yet, because if you look at the Asiatic lions, they lived their extent range was all the way from the western part of India across the Middle East onto almost northern Africa as well. So they had a huge, huge range. There could have been, it's now postulated that could have been two or three subspecies of the lions, but generally speaking, the Asiatic lion occupied a massive range about 1,000 years ago, but have now shrunk to one pocket. So there's still a lot of work in terms of ensuring the survival of this species here. And speaking of ensuring the survival, it it comes down to the efforts of many stakeholders in this that has actually um, ensured the protection of these animals, or ensured that they have a better tomorrow, or ensure the fact that we are very privileged, in fact, to go out and be able to see these animals and take pictures and talk about them nicely, sitting in our living rooms like this. But there's been a lot of hard work. And when we talk about conservation here in NatHab, we know we cannot have a conversation about it without mentioning one of our strategic partners in this effort, which is the WWF. Now, if you've traveled with us before, you know the kind of work, and WWF is probably the biggest conservation, or at least the one that comes to mind immediately when you talk about a worldwide effort that goes in. In the 50 odd years that WWF has been in existence, they have grown into the world's largest conservation network. I think it's more than about 100 countries that they work with, and supported by about 5 million members, and that number is growing. And these are members who are passionate, much as yourselves who have traveled before. I know we've encountered many people and had wonderful discussions about where you've been, and the efforts that you've contributed in. And and I think one of the wonderful things about this organization is, at the heart of it is a realization that to protect an animal, sometimes you need to take different approaches. Now, while each country has several projects going, I've seen here in India, we've had things working on community development, such as the access to education in Bhutan, as they've done, or the access to provide clean drinking water. And, in a developing country, it's important, well, it's essential to understand that these sort of primary needs are the most important. When you can't talk about conservation to someone who is living in abject poverty, we're wondering where they're going to get their next meal from, or how they're going to feed their kids the next day. You can't talk to them of these grand schemes of why we need to protect these animals if you do not take care of the basic needs first. And this, I think, is the biggest challenge working in the Asian context, is that we have vast swaths of population that do not have access to many of the things you would take for granted in an urbanized or a Western world. And therefore, conservation and wildlife protection takes a really, I mean, not even a backseat, but sort of beyond, in the boot, maybe out of the car even. And so it's important to approach this from a different standpoint, and that's where conservation travel, I think something that we do at NatHab plays a very, very big role. Since 2003, NatHab and WWF have been involved, partnering together, and just traveling with this company. WWF has raised more than 6 million. I mean, NatHab has raised more than 6 million for WWF projects worldwide, and does continue to give about 1% of gross sales annually, and this partnership, I think, is will continue till the till the end of this decade, for sure. So traveling with that, so contributes to work on the ground, and like I said, the work on the ground is across, it's many gamuts, but there's one particular project that I would like to talk to you about specifically. Now, in India, they've been present here since 1969. So one of the earlier efforts, and if you recall back, I spoke about the Wildlife Protection Act of 1972 in India, and in 1973, with the government, with the support of organizations such as the WWF, launched the Project Tiger initiative. And this was first of its kind. It's the first international collaboration that our country had, where the focus was on developing critical regions, identifying critical regions for wildlife protection, picking a few priority species. The tiger was picked as one, and then, like I said, we worked with rhinos, and elephants, and so on, and enabling a more sustainable operation across the country. So, one of the biggest successes has been working at a community level, working, like I said, with basic needs, access to basic facilities and education, so on, which has been a big resounding success. And one of the biggest plans, which is a wonderful initiative taken across, mostly happening in Nepal at the moment, but at some parts of India, is called the Terai Arc landscape. Now, this is one of a kind in the sense that it takes it's a shift from being focused on a particular species to being focused on a particular landscape. Now, the Terai region, just to give you some background, is right at the foothills of the Himalayas. It borders both countries of India, Nepal, some parts of Bhutan as well. And it accounts for about 85 mammal species across this, including the tiger, the rhino, and the elephants. Okay, so some of our biggest, or the mega fauna as we speak about, is there. In it can I beg your pardon, it consists about 12% of Nepal's landscape, and a smaller portion in India, but it's one of the most densely populated regions of the world. There's close to about 7.5 million people living on the Nepal side, and about equal amount of people living on the Indian side. So we're looking at a group about 15 to 18 million people across this landscape, which also needs access, or we also have to address their livelihoods when we're talking about this. So the landscape is basically looking at connecting corridors through the various protected areas across these regions, enabling animals to pass through freely. Because, like I said, ecologically, that is an important function, where animals are able to move through particular landscapes, able to breed outside of their territory, and also expand as numbers grow. But the important part about this is that it takes a community centric approach. Now, one fantastic conservation initiative that has happened in Nepal is the community forest, which I'll talk about in a couple of slides from now, where the local people that live in an area are given that ownership or that responsibility, um, of maintaining a particular green cover in a particular area, where they have access to it, and not only from a utilitarian perspective, but also understand the value of preserving a forest, whether it is in terms of maintaining the climate of the region, ensuring that the water systems are kept flowing, and also the animals that live in there. But apart from this, there's been several global initiatives. Some of you may be familiar. All of these working with the conservation of wildlife. And again, today being a special day to talk about this, I just like to just throw it out there, saying that if you don't already support an initiative, find something that speaks to you, and in any small way, involve yourself in there, which because we know a lot of these organizations, and we've seen as an expedition leader going out in the field, I can ascertain for a fact that without the help of non-governmental organizations, much of our wildlife protection or much of our nature preservation would have hit roadblocks without the expertise and the manpower they're able to garner and support, and of course the funding being the most important, lending to the efforts of that program. Now, it's not just important to have non-governmental efforts. It takes a national level um, effort as well to ensure of this. And one thing that I can speak about, because I live here, so I in India, and it is my home country. I'd like to talk to you about the Wildlife Protection Act of India, 1972. Now, like I said, it was probably our first comprehensive protection act that we've had for animals, and we've not had a more comprehensive one ever since. There have been various amendments through this act through the years, but this was based off I mean, sorry. Prior to this, what existed was, sort of game protection acts, which were instituted when India was still a British colony, and so on. But this was focused primarily on the protection of animals. And one of the landmark judgments in this, that it banned, it was a total ban on hunting, trophy keeping, and trade. Which, going back to the 70s, also understand that India was just 4 decades old. We were a new country. The concept of India did not exist prior to 1947. It was a mixture of about 660 princely states, all with their own agendas and autonomies. But the concept of a nation began in 1947, and then, a few decades later, we had a very, very important act passed. And that has actually held us good through these years in terms of the preservation of our natural spaces that we have. Um, this not only covers wildlife, but also covers plant species as well. And over the years, we've been identifying several species in different sections and different schedules. Species have been put in, species have been taken out, and of course, as a success of something goes, they've been removed from the act. But one thing that has remained true throughout has been the fact that there's been absolute bans on hunting and trophy keeping. So if one were to travel to India, so all of that, what we saw historically, those dozens of tigers being shot, a few hundred elephants going out on these hunts, rhinos being shot, all of that has ceased to exist by one simple act of parliament that was passed by truly a visionary prime minister at that point of time. But similar to India, much of our neighboring countries also have several policies. Like I said, Nepal, many of the Wildlife Protection Act was passed by the royal family. Uh, and of course, a lot of these acts are now being written. The Act of 2029, as they call it, because it is a future centric act in Nepal, that they are now encompassing a more wider landscape, where they talk about national parks and wildlife um, conservation, creating more areas for it, and connecting all of these corridors, which I spoke to you about as an initiative with the Terai Arc landscape. So they've identified 38 endangered species, including the rhino, red panda, uh, the barasinga, and the gharials, the animals that we've spoken about, and across a broader umbrella, where they're looking at increasing um, the areas for these animals and too. And for this particular country, I must just say at this point, if you've traveled to Nepal, you'll know this. It is a country that relies very heavily on foreign remittance. Many Nepali people leave the country to go and work abroad because of more lucrative opportunities, and so a lot of the community actually relies on money being sent back to them. They're a wonderful people. They're a very hardworking people, but unfortunately, the landscape that they live in is not always conducive. I mean, they're suffering really bad floods at the moment. We've heard earthquakes. The Himalayas are a seismic zone, so there's constant calamities and so on that, um, and compounded with unrest which they had for over 15 odd years. It is truly heartening to see that in spite of all of these things happening, in spite of a large swaths of population not having access to much of the forget luxuries, but also just needs that many of the rest of the world enjoys, having a comprehensive policy saying that yes, as a country we will take this, we will focus on preserving our natural heritage is really, I mean, it does warm the cockles of one's heart, and all the more reason why we should visit and contribute to work that's on the ground there. Now, neighboring country of Bhutan, and again, if you've traveled there, you know how ingrained it is in the public psyche. Probably the only country in the world that puts its people's happiness above everything else. Now, we as countries across the world, we have progress, we have development, we have all of these little goals that we say yes, this is what we need to be, this is where we need to be in 20 years. I mean, we've heard it in many a political speech, we've heard it in many a government address. But Bhutan is unique in the sense that it says we want our population to be the happiest people. It is voted the happiest country in the world. And at the center of this thing, what they call the gross national happiness, there are four pillars. And at the center, one central pillar is is environmental conservation or the preservation of their environment. And again, if you've traveled to Bhutan, you will see um, the green cover in the country has grown. It is the only carbon neutral country at the moment, and they have actively been connecting corridors, increasing natural spaces across the country, working concertedly on education and the upliftment of the standard of living of people. So they're actually able to talk about species and have those much more philosophical conversations, I would say, or more higher ended conversations on what needs to be done for the preservation of species. But apart from national level, I mean, while it's wonderful to see, and one can't work if there is no national framework or no policy framework in progress. We've also seen in these few decades the tireless work of many individuals and organizations working towards the welfare of animals. Uh, in again, take into context that India, Nepal, and to a large extent Sri Lanka, Bangladesh for sure, these are countries that have a burgeoning population. We're looking at vast tracts of population living under poverty level. We're also looking at people who live for less than $50 a day. Uh, we're looking at minimum wage. I mean, so we're looking at a capita income of 200 odd $250 a day, which many people survive on. Um, to talk about conservation, one needs to think about the people as well. But in spite of all of this, we've had wonderful public efforts, private efforts of many organizations in here that have literally brought back animals from the brink. And here I've chosen to focus a lot on the gharials and the crocodile breeding program that was the first of its kind and the only one that we had for several years that brought back these species. And it's wonderful to see public participate in this and understand the role of these animals in the broader ecosystem context. We've had several organizations working with animal rescue, as you see this baby leopard being rescued from a sugarcane field where the mother had given birth. and rehabilitated and rewilded as well. And smaller initiatives, even micro level people, where they're talking about frogs, we're talking about snakes, we're talking about birds, we're talking about insects and butterflies and so on. We have many, many initiatives that are now growing, and it was wonderful to see this present week a lot of public initiatives and people involved in that. And speaking of the public, there is an innate nature, thanks to some of our early teachings of Buddhism or some of our animist followings. Many people in this overall landscape across Asia have an innate affiliation to animals. So it's very easy for us as educators or for us as influencers, I would say, in this landscape, to tell people that there is value in your wildlife. There is value to people coming and seeing your wildlife, and it's not just the local population that believe in it, but we also need an international movement, excuse me, or people who are interested in going out and seeing, much like yourselves, go out and seeing these crazy animals, spending, you know, bumpy rides on roads, waking up at the crack of dawn, staying up till, nightfall to go and see some particular species. But it is that motivation that drives conservation efforts across the country. And many of these success stories illustrates the region's commitment to wildlife conservation, which showcase, effective strategies, and these strategies really that has to involve community engagement, legal frameworks like the wildlife protection acts we've seen in countries, and dedicated conservation projects run by experts uh, in the field. But all is not good. There is still a long way to go. The battle is not over yet. There are several species teetering on the edge. Ironically, a species that has been at the forefront of conservation, or a symbol of conservation for decades, the giant panda, is still under a few hundred individuals. We've got species of sea turtles that are constantly battling for survival because of large scale and indiscriminate fishing. Orangutans in Borneo are again down to a few hundred individuals in a few pockets. Indian bustards, pangolins, which is uh, the highest traded commodity uh, for a few years now, has been pangolin scale. So we've got many, many animals that are still teetering on the edge, that still requires large scale efforts, that still requires funds, that still requires resources in order for them to ensure their survival. And in today's day and age, like I've mentioned several times now, there is a growing human population, compounded with the loss of habitat to sustain that population, with things such as a changing climate not allowing animals to adapt. And if you listen to a webinar I did a few weeks ago, we're talking about animals such as the snow leopards, for instance, beginning to move lower down, and animals such as leopards are beginning to move higher up because of the boundaries being a little dissolved in between because of climate change, and of course wildlife trade being one of the major things, losses to this. I mean, wildlife trade, probably, if you look at it, is the most destructive or directly destructive force that we see visibly, apart from habitat loss. Wildlife trade is the fourth largest trade for profit, driven by crazy profit margins. It's annually, I think, it is worth about 20 billion US dollars, and Asia is at the hub of this. You've got India, China, Laos, Vietnam, all of them major key players. When I say key players, not from a nation, but in areas where, items or animals are getting traded out of. And to put that, and many people put themselves in the line of fire when it comes to this. The official number is about 1,000 odd rangers across this landscape have lost their lives protecting these animals from the wildlife trade. So there are a lot of problems still there. There are a lot of very, very dire situations that are in the near future. But I don't want to end this webinar on a dire note, but I want to poke a question at you. So, what could you do? in order to preserve, or in order to ensure the survival of our animals, and by that extension, our natural spaces as well. Um, there are six very simple things that I put together, and which for you to just think about. Of course, there is a more direct action if you participate or contribute in some conservation effort or the other. Um, Also begin to advocate against illegal trade, cruelty to animals, and refuse the use of certain things that from red listed animals and plants, especially. With animals, it's easy to do. With plants, it's a little hard because sometimes we don't even know what species it is. But there's a lot of critically endangered plants that are also traded quite freely as garden plants. Um, and very simple things. And I think at the center of all of this is something that both you and I will agree is we can conserve animals through our travels. And conservation travel or conservation through exploration is something that is core to NatHab's philosophy. It's core to our belief system, and it's reflected in the kind of trips we do. So, and like I said, choosing to travel with us actually directly works with conservation on the field. And traveling to places like this supports work that's happening there. It is an encouragement not only to people but also as a monetary support for some of the projects that we do there. Simple things you could do at home, like planting native species, avoiding the use of pesticides if you have a garden. Encourage animals to come into your garden. Encourage, when I say animals, I mean things like bees and butterflies and other species that then translates into a larger ecosystem, and having that little patch. I mean, how wonderful it'll be if all of us have our own little patch, and it could be something as three pots on a apartment balcony to a small backyard, that we say, okay, we have a mini ecosystem in our place, and we are doing a bit for the environment. Um, be mindful on the products you use. Right now, the city where I live in is going through a no plastic ban, which is worked wonderfully. We've visibly seen the trash component reduce, which means that little trash is not going out in the environment. There is already a pre-existing culture of reusing things, using less disposable. If again, if you've traveled with us, we do not use single-use plastic. We do not use disposables on our trips ever. And of course, always raise awareness, take this message to people, talk to people, influence people, vote for the right people in power, support policies that preserve the environment. And these are all little things you can do, sitting in your home. So while there is still a long way to go, I would say the future is not very bleak if we all, as citizens of this world, do our bit. And with that, Brooke, I'd like to hand it over to you and to our audience to hear thoughts, comments, and I'm happy to talk about if you have any questions. Go on.
Wow, Conan, that was incredible. You had me sucked in the entire time. And from all the comments I've been receiving, it sounds like everybody else was just as enamored with your presentation. We are well past time, so I'm just going to ask one question. And everybody else, if you have any further questions, feel free to email in. But yeah, on which tours could we possibly see gharials or Asiatic lions?
So the gharial is possible to see when we do our Nepal tour, and but also both species, if you're very keen on, can be done as extensions to pre-existing India tours. Now the Asiatic lion, we do not run a separate tour, but it is offered as a customized extension if you, for example, are doing our tiger quest, or if you're doing our central India tour in India. You could go across, and we could be very very happily set up that trip for you just to go see the lions and back. The Gharial, one of the best places to see it is in Chitwan, where we go for our Nepal tour. But they're also present in some rivers across northern India, and in fact, is a nice extension to do out of Delhi to a particular sanctuary where I showed you some images from, where they've actually the captive breeding and release of gharials has been fairly successful. But so both of these are available to do. So write your adventure specialist, and we'll be happy to put it together.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. I also can agree that Chitwan is a beautiful, incredible place to see rhinos and all kinds of stuff, and gharials. I also saw them there, and I was very excited about that. When you get to see an endangered species in the wild, it just, I'm also a conservation biologist, so it just really fills your heart when you get to see that. So, all right, Conan, like I said, we are well past time. You did such a fantastic presentation, and I will turn it to you for any last closing comments.
Thank you, Brooke. I will not keep our audience any longer, and I apologize for spilling over time. It's just a topic that's close to heart, and I need to sometimes stop myself. But I just leave you with this image, and to say that you can make a difference as an individual, sitting right in your home. Find an area that works with you, and continue to travel with us, because every little effort makes a big difference, has a ripple effect across the world. So I'll just leave you with this image, and hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and hope to see you this side, where we go look at some very, very crazy and interesting animals. Thank you all. Lovely.
And thank you, Conan, for taking the time to present to us today. And I would like to thank everyone who tuned in. Join us Monday for our next daily dose of nature. You can check out next week's lineup, including registration links, on our website at nathab.com/webinars. And keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement. We did record today's presentation, and we will have that replay available on our website soon. With that, I will conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.